Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first of Decorative Stone Solutions virtual How to Specify a Landscape Ground Cover Stone series. My name is Randy Jurgensen. I'm the architectural rep here at Decorative Stone Solutions, or DSS for short. I've been around for about 14 years, and I'll be your guide for the remainder of this 4 to 5 part series. A quick note, if the virtual experience is not your thing, I am available for in-person sessions and love to treat for lunch and learn. So hit me up and we can schedule an in-person version. Please consider me an additional resource and don't be afraid to reach out to me with any landscape stone related questions. Without further ado, let's jump into the very first topic, a very sexy one indeed, and that is how to specify landscape boulders. Today we'll be talking about specifying landscape stone boulders, as well as some general rule of thumb of what to do and what not to do. I'd like to start by defining exactly what a landscape stone boulder is. For our purposes, we define boulders as pieces of natural stone that are greater than 18 inches in diameter. Because they are very dense, most boulders will require mechanical means in order to help move and place them. Things such as dollies, forklifts, front-end loaders, cranes. Anything less than 18 inches can typically be moved by hand and wheelbarrow, but over 18 inches, you will be needing some mechanical help. Boulders can be naturally occurring rounded pieces, such as seen on the left, or they can be angular, blasted, broken pieces like those on the right. Nature tends to only give us so many of the tumbled rounded versions, so the majority of boulders out there are typically the angular variety, where you'll have many more color and size options than in the rounded version. A little bit on how to specify, and we'll start with boulder sizing. This is typically where the most confusion and misunderstanding stems from. What we most often see on a set of landscape plans is a boulder legend like what you see here. It has a boulder size callouts along with the quantities of each size. Our ask as a landscape stone supplier is that the designer please only give 1 or 2 dimensions. If 3 dimensions are called out, such as shown here, the chances of getting enough boulders that match those dimensions is very slim. Besides, nature doesn't produce boulders in uniform sizes, and natural landscapes don't have all of the same sizes in them. So don't be thrown off if the boulders aren't exactly the way that you imagine them in your mind. It's going to come out okay. It's going to look very natural in the end. These are products of nature and not manufactured to size, so some realistic flexibility is needed. I don't like to see where we have 60 pieces called out that are 3 by 3 by 3 because it's just not realistic, and it's not something that you actually really want in the end to have all the pieces the same size. In most cases, if the application is just for landscape site boulders, you can call out, a small, medium, and large, where small might be 2 foot, mediums might be 3 to 4 foot, and larges might be 4 to 5 foot. And you'll end up with a good natural looking result in the end. There's a caveat to that, and that's something like what's seen here, where pieces are to be used for benches, amphitheaters, seating, stair treads, those types of things where very specific sizes are needed. And those are available. You just limited in what types of boulders can be found and had in that particular rectangular shapes, and you will typically have a premium pricing associated with pieces like that. Something very important to have in your office spec is that they should be called out to be buried 1/3 of the height of the stone or to the point of largest circumference. So they look like if they were unearthed via natural erosion forces and not just dropped into place by a tractor bucket or fell out of the sky. This does mean that the designer needs to remember that they're going to end up with smaller pieces than what they actually called out, because a lot of the finished product is being lost underground. So if you're calling out a 3-foot boulder, in the end, it's going to be only 2 foot of it being exposed. So For that reason, we do say, go big. Don't be afraid to go big because of that. A few examples of boulders that were buried a third of the height of the stone and make for a fairly natural look. These pieces here were probably actually buried more than a third. And then something to acknowledge here is that even when a boulder is not buried a third into the ground, a simulated buried look can be achieved by spreading organic ground cover or inorganic ground cover around the base of the boulders to a sufficient depth to make it look like they were actually buried. So it's a bit of a cheat factor, a way to cheat that. I told you I was going to show some what not to do's, and this being one of them. Some boulders that were placed on grade without being buried and have created a very unnatural, unrealistic, unattractive look. Pieces that were just set onto the existing ground cover and walked away from. So I don't expect to see any of these at your projects. Touch a bit on size and what that relates to in weight. The density of most natural stone boulders lies somewhere in the 120 to 160 pounds per cubic foot range. An example here is that you can see a 3-foot boulder weighs about 3/4 of a ton, whereas a boulder twice the size, 6 foot, weighs 4.5 tons. So as you go up in size, the boulder weight does increase incrementally. And if you ever need help with figuring out what a boulder weighs, reach out to me. That is something we can help with. Talk a little about boulder pricing. Various suppliers use different methods to price out boulders, but the most two common ones are pricing them by the ton or by the piece. And this slide simply gives you a little bit of the pros and cons of the way that they're priced out, whether it's by the ton or by the piece, and how that affects the pricing. In the end, the price of purchasing landscape boulders is determined more by the shipping and handling costs of moving boulders than the cost of the stone itself. So rock is cheap, it's moving around, that's expensive. And something else to keep in mind is that when specifying boulders, that the price and the sizing, that the pricing jumps dramatically once the size exceeds 5 foot. I'll talk a little more of that in a minute. And the other thing to mention here is that a certain amount of scarring and chipping are standard for products that aren't individually palletized and handled. This would increase pricing dramatically. So most boulder products are delivered in dump trucks. I promised I'd touch on boulders that were over 5 foot in size and how that increases the price. As seen here, this is about a 12-foot boulder, and this is having to be placed at the job site via crane. It also had to get loaded at the quarry site via crane and then transported from quarry to job site on a flatbed, low bed trailer. So all those things are out of the ordinary for the typical landscape boulders and do add to the price significantly. So if you go over 5 foot, they no longer can go in an end dump. They have to go on a flatbed, and then they have to be handled differently at the quarry and at the job site. Just an idea of that 12-foot boulder being placed in the ground with the crane. You're losing a lot of the height again. So what was 12 foot becomes about a 7-foot piece once it's been buried and finished in the ground. I wanted to touch a little bit about boulder delivery and placement. While not necessarily the designer's responsibility, I thought it worth mentioning here. The most common and least expensive way of delivering boulders is dump delivery. This is an end dump truck being shown here, and that's most typical of how boulders are delivered. They slide out the back. They do have a certain amount of scarring and chipping that are going to be standard for products delivered in this method, but the least expensive. Boulders can also be put on pallets and delivered with forklifts strapped to a pallet. This is the most expensive way, but typically the least amount of scarring in the handling process. But not every boulder can be delivered that way, but some of the higher end products can be. And then crane deliveries often are kind of somewhere in the middle as far as price is concerned. They can often be necessary for extremely large pieces, as we saw, or sites with poor accessibility with other types of machinery. As far as the placement is concerned, you'll often see forklift or reach lifts placing boulders, skid steers and front end loaders, strapped crane placement like the large boulder we saw previously, or there's a backhoe or crane that have thumbs that pinch boulders. So it comes and pinches pieces and then places them in sight. So it's a pretty exact way of placing boulders. That's another option. All right, so that'll kind of conclude the quick and dirty of how to specify landscape stone boulders. This tutorial was meant to cover the most common 80% of the questions we get related to landscape boulders. If you have a scenario that's in the 20% that wasn't covered, or any other stone related questions for that matter, please reach out to me and we can discuss in more detail. My contact information is here, email or phone. And if you like what you saw, please sign up to receive periodic similar content at our website at decorativestonesolutions.com. Love for you to stay tuned for part 2 of this informational series titled What You Need to Know About Specifying Stone as a Landscape Ground Cover. Coming soon. Take care.